The night has stretched long, but he continued stalking across an open field. He has been walking for 3 days, stopping only to drink from the stream or to tend to the blisters that have crept across his feet. Perhaps the village merchant sent him the wrong way. It seemed unlikely, though. The man was terrified. Kazan had thrown him through the stall, smashed his head through the table, demanded to know who had bought the salvaged armor. The merchant was lucky Kazan had let him live. Should this end up a fool's errand, that decision will certainly be overturned. The thin haze of early morning mist gives way and reveals another village, surrounded by farmland. The sun peeks furtively over the crops. This must be the place. The hardest working farmers tend to their fields silently, barely raising their heads as he walks past them. These men are not the imposters. They work the land, same as they always have, racing the sun to take their harvests before the heat can oppress. He stops next to one. Where are they? The man points to a stable near the center of the village. Kazan nods, voices the barest of acknowledgments, and continues walking. From this distance, Kazan can make out only vague shapes of men. He strides in their direction. As they come into focus, hate boils up inside Kazan. The men sit in chairs, empty jugs by their hands, sleeping gracelessly, their stomachs filled with gains extorted from their own. The smaller of the men still wears a kusazari around his waist, even as he sleeps. The larger one wakes as he stomps towards them, fumbles for a weapon, finds only one of the jugs. He holds it up as if to hide behind it. Without hesitation, Kazan strikes both the jug and the man's head with his kanabo, shattering them both instantly. The smaller one comes to and falls to his knees, immediately apologizing, begging for his life. Seeing this man in the armor of his fallen brothers, a cruel mockery of the purpose he has proudly committed his life to, creates a pit in Kazan's stomach. He lashes out. Not once, like with the first one. He lashes out over and over. There is no grace in these strikes. He strikes aggressively, sloppily, across the body, the head, the legs. He hears screams as women and children wake and come out of their homes, and he stops. As he stops, he realizes the voice he hears screaming loudest is his own. He strips the armor from the formless, broken mass below him and places it in a bag and begins walking back. The farmers, who looked up only briefly from their back-breaking work, return their focus to the soil. Perhaps his reputation had preceded him, or perhaps they had been tipped off, but this time they were ready for him. The river upon which this village sat, usually rushing and vibrant, seemed almost as if it sat still, holding its breath. Dark clouds hung on the horizon the entire day, refusing to approach, waiting for some resolution. Nearly a dozen men, dressed in broken and incomplete sets of armor, some armed with swords, others with plows and hoes, stand in a crooked line in front of him. They stand aggressively, but awkwardly, their confused stances betraying their inexperience. Kazan plants his feet across the river from them, grips his kanabo firmly, lowers it to his waist, and waits. Stares through his mask at the men. Waits. They rush him, disorganized, terrified. He fells them, one by one. No wasted movement. Their attacks do not touch him. One after another, they run up against his weapon and crumple, bleeding, in the water. He stands there, long after they have all fallen, feet still planted. Around his ankles, the river begins to flow. 11 tendrils of crimson stretch down the river. The clouds finally crack open as cold, heavy rain sets in. Then, suddenly, pain. His calf muscle twitches as he feels cold metal pierce a small gap in his leg plates. He turns. A boy, perhaps 18, stands there, his face resolute. No stolen armor, no stolen weapon. Tears dot his cheeks, obscured by rain, but he shows no fear. The boy pulls the rake from Kazan's leg and raises it, mimicking the stance of a true samurai. Kazan grabs the head of the rake, squeezes. He feels hot blood run down his wrist as it plants in his palm. He stares the boy down, but the boy does not wince. Die, Oni. Oni? The word shakes him. Me? Why would this boy call me Oni? He feels that familiar feeling beginning to bubble deep within his chest again, like it did with the imposters. He tears the rake from the boy's hand, tosses it into the river. Leave, boy. Call me that again, and you'll die like they did. Chuzo holds up a book in front of Kazan. Kazan squints at its cover, trying to make sense of the strange characters on it. I found this in my son's belongings. Is it from the foreigners? Yes. Kazan sneers and turns away. Why would you allow such a thing in your home? He was hiding it from me, Kazan. His friends have been trying to learn their language, to work with them, trade with them. What next? Will he want to leave with them? Go abroad? Shuzo tosses the book behind him in disgust. I've heard a group of the traitors are circumventing the shogun's tariffs, falsifying records, bringing in more than allowed, and moving the surplus at night. Something needs to be done about this. Kazan stares into his teacup, deep in thought. Shuzo has always been a reliable source, a friend even at times. Trade with the foreigners? What did he know about that? What would you have me do, Shuzo? Shuzo shrinks back, nervous. I'm just telling you what I've heard. Someone needs to do something. The late summer sun hangs lazily over Nagasaki. Kazan stands on the shore, watching the ships of the foreign trading company dock in Dejima. The workers move at a frenetic pace, loading and unloading the ships, eager to work after months of waiting. Clerks zip from place to place, counting and recording inventories. To the untrained eye, it seems chaotic, unknowable. But Kazan has been training his eye. One ship in particular stuck out. While the others would dock, unload, load, and dock, one stayed longer than the others, and he was sure he saw it unload and load twice, once a day and once at night, and it didn't leave. Perhaps everyone was too busy to pay it any mind. Perhaps nobody wanted to be the one who raised the issue. Perhaps they were all in on it. Kazan thinks of Shuzo's son, so enthusiastic to learn about the foreigners. He thinks of his own son, whose own interest waned in the way of the sword after his injury. Would he one day be seduced by this way of life as well? Kazan looks at his hand and realizes it's balled into a tight fist, his knuckles pale and stiff. If these men are criminals, they will face justice tonight. Honoring his family name was never enough for Kazan Yamaoka. He wanted to surpass his father's reputation and end what he saw as the thinning of samurai culture, with farmers often posing as samurai. His father tried to turn Kazan's attention to more noble pursuits, but Kazan refused to heed his advice, and borrowing his father's katana, he embarked on a dark pilgrimage to prove his worth and rid Japan of impostors. Ignoring the code that had been taught to him, Kazan killed impostors in the hills and the valleys, on the beaches and in the woodland. The killings were brutal, cruel, and morbid. He humiliated farmers and warriors alike, yanking off their top knots and stripping them of their armor. His rage, bloodlust, and perverse sense of honor knew no bounds. Monks believed he was possessed by something dark and otherworldly, and cursed him, while a noble lord began to call him Yamaoka, the rageful samurai, an insult both to Kazan and his family. Determined to redeem his family's name, Kazan now butchered anyone who dared call him Yamaoka. The insult confused him. He had defeated the best, and he had purified the samurai class by ridding the land of impostors. How could anyone refer to him as an ogre? Had it been because he had marched onto a battlefield to cut down the fiercest warriors? Had it been because he had taken a kanabo and dashed hundreds of skulls with it? Or had it been because of his need to secure a trophy from his victims? It didn't matter. Being called an ogre was more than he could bear, and an ominous voice in his head urged him to strike down the lord who had desecrated his name. As Kazan made for the lord's town, he suddenly found himself face to face with a samurai standing on a dirt road, blocking his way. Kazan readied his kanabo. Without a word, the samurai attacked and quickly secured the upper hand, but he hesitated. With a devastating blow, Kazan crushed the samurai's head and cracked his helmet. As Kazan approached the fallen samurai, he saw his father's face and staggered back to his haunches. His father stared at Kazan with mingled shame and regret as he issued his last breath. Kazan closed his eyes and screamed in agony until he could scream no more. When he opened his eyes again, his father was gone. Not only had he killed his father, but he had allowed thieves to steal his body for armor. Bitter, lost, and disillusioned, Kazan roamed the land aimlessly with his father's voice rattling in his head, taunting him, reminding him of his failures, sending him into fits of uncontrollable black rage. One day, walking in the woods, Kazan happened upon an Oni statue. He stopped and stood motionless for a long moment. The weathered and overgrown statue seemed to be ridiculing him, accusing him of being the imposter samurai he had so desperately sought to destroy. Kazan shook the laughing voice out of his head and half remembered the lord who had ridiculed him as Oni Yamaoka. With renewed anger, Kazan journeyed to a town high up in the snowy mountains where the lord resided. A dozen samurai met Kazan at the gates of the town. A dozen samurai fell to his kanabo. His speed and strength were unmatched. His rage was incomprehensible. Covered in blood and gore, Kazan battled through the town and soon found the lord hiding in a villa. He dragged him out of a cabinet, sliced his tendons to immobilize him, and watched him beg and squirm like a dog. Without hesitation, he thrust his fist into the lord's mouth and yanked out the wicked tongue that had desecrated his name. Satisfied, Kazan exited the villa to find himself surrounded by dozens of farmers wielding rusted scythes, sharp pitchforks, and heavy clubs. He survived the first few assaults, but there were too many attackers coming from every direction. Within moments, Kazan was on the ground staring at a cold, indifferent, darkening sky, as farmers took turns stabbing and torturing the Oni who had butchered their beloved lord. The frenzied mob dragged Kazan into a small stone mill to continue the torture and finally left him to die a slow, agonizing death. When they returned, the mill was filled with a strange black fog, and Kazan's body and the kanabo were nowhere to be found. It was the beginning of a dark legend about a rageful Oni haunting the town.